Hello everyone, we are on tweet number 5 of Learn Kubernetes in 10 tweets. In this diagram, we see that submitting YAML to the API is fairly straightforward. More specifically, the YAML is declarative versus imperative. So declarative means that you describe how you want your application and its end state to be, as opposed to imperative, where you're performing one command after the other. If you've watched previous videos in this series, you would have seen me typing, kubectl create deploy or kubectl run. Those are all imperative commands. So the benefit of using a declarative model and specifying YAML instead of running these commands one by one is because you can keep the YAML files in version control. You can apply them over and over to have that end state change, and it's some form of idempotency there. And you can also keep track of what changes occurred and provides a paper trail too. So you can know what resources are deployed in your cluster. So let's go ahead and demonstrate that. So I have a repository here that I'm going to clone down. So git clone. And I'm going to change directory into that repository. And then in here is a Redis guestbook application. So before I deploy this using my YAML, so here are the YAML. I have 1, 2, 3 deployments and 3 services. Before I submit this to the API, what I can also do is create a new namespace. We talked about namespaces earlier, right? Where it creates a virtual cluster, in a sense, separating all of these resources from the resources that are in other namespaces. So let's go ahead and create a namespace with kubectl create namespace, or NS for short, and then we'll call it guestbook. And once you create this namespace, instead of having to type the namespace name with every command, like you would have to do kubectl get pods and then -n and then the namespace name, in this case guestbook, we can change our context. So this is the easier way to change our context so that we're always looking within that namespace as opposed to the default namespace, which is a lot of times the default. So in order to do that, we can do kubectl config and then set context. And then we'll do -- current because we want to still be accessing this cluster, but we just want to change the namespace. So we'll do current, and then we'll do, let me just put a backslash here so we can continue on the next line. And then a -- namespace, and then we'll put guestbook here, which is that new namespace that we just created. Okay, so now that when we look into our resources, all we'll see is the resources that are within that context of the namespace. All right, so I'm going to change directory back to home just so I can create more space in the terminal here and clear the screen. And now, oops, actually I didn't mean to do that. So I'll change directory back to Kate's and then Redis. And now I can deploy all of the YAML in this directory, right? I can just deploy this with a single command. So I can do kubectl apply -f, and then I can signify the current directory with a dot and the /. And that creates all of the resources in my separate YAML. And I'm basically submitting this to the API using the kubectl command. And then the API will declaratively ensure that my resources are running as I have specified in my YAML. So now let's change directory and clear the screen. Now if we do kubectl get pods, we can see all the pods in our namespace in our deployments. There's 3 deployments, a front end, a follower, and a leader. And then if we do kubectl get services, we can see that there's 3 different services created as well. 2 internal. You know that they're internal by the type, which is cluster IP. And then there's a node port service. So a node port service extends a port on our node, so our service can be available from the node itself on whatever port specified. In this case, we specified port 30,000. So we can actually browse to our node, access it using its IP address, and use that port 30,000 to access our guestbook application. But before that, I just want to show you something that you can use to view all the resources. So we can do kubectl get all, and that will show me all my resources in this namespace. Okay, so let's clear the screen, and just to get my public IP, I'll do a curl canhasip.com, and I'll copy that public IP address, and I'll go over to my browser and paste that in, followed by :30,000. And there's my guestbook application. So I can use my guestbook application that I just created and is running on Kubernetes.